There we go. Add time, because I hate it when the screen shuts off and you got like 5 minutes left. No microphone in this class. Okay. All right, let's get started here. So, before we get into anything, I just wanted to introduce L'Oreal. So this is L'Oreal Giffen. She is a PhD candidate in the department, and she's going to be your TA for the lab. So on, not this Thursday, but next Thursday, when you go, I think it's just next door to B38. So you have super easy navigation for this class this term. This is who you'll be meeting, and she's going to walk you through activities. Did you want to say anything about yourself, L'Oreal?
Yeah, I'm L'Oreal. You can call me L'Oreal, Lori. I've TA'd this course twice before, so I'm pretty familiar with the content, and I think the labs are really awesome to have, and you folks can use that as an opportunity to like ask me questions if you want better understanding of a course concept or material or assignments. I'm there for you to kind of use me. So show up to the labs. We'll try to make them as fun as possible, I think. Yeah, I'll introduce myself a little bit more in the actual lab. I'll tell you about like my research areas and stuff like that. But yeah, feel free to email me, talk to me in labs. I hope I'm pretty approachable, and that's really the purpose of the labs, is to have it as a resource for you folks to do as well as you can in this course. So yeah.
All right.
Cool.
You're dismissed. Can you kick the door shut on your way past? Awesome. Thank you, L'Oreal. Okay. Where am I? Right, it's Wednesday. Okay, so we're going to kind of pick up where we left off last time. So we ended off, kind of on this slide. We were talking about some of the challenges, of research access, and some of the things politically that might potentially lead to some bias in research findings, right? So, gatekeepers, how do you get into a research space, right? There's often someone who's going to let you in, right? If you're trying to get into prisons, you might have to deal with the Ministry of Justice. They might have some conditions attached. And so, knowing that can definitely skew research. And so typically people will want to be honest about things like that when you're writing up your research. Okay, I guess we're going to go on. We're going to start. And this is essentially, so you won't be touching it until next week on Thursday, but this is basically where your first lab will kind of start, which is formulating a research question. Yeah. Oh, there's lots to say about this. So a good research question. Now, the research question is really critical, right? Because the research question that in a lot of ways structures everything that you do as a researcher. So coming up with a research question that makes sense and is well structured and works really well is really critical. Because if you get this, it's kind of like, you take that first wrong turn in a maze and you're completely lost, right? If you've ever been out to the corn maze, that's by Devon. Take the first turn, you make the wrong turn, you're completely lost for the rest of the time you're out there. Research question's kind of similar. It's going to be what guides a lot of the research process. And so getting it wrong will put you off on the wrong foot. And it's not the end of the world. But one of the things, especially if you go on to grad school or if you're doing an honors thesis, if you get the research question wrong, it costs you time, right? Because eventually you're going to run into a brick wall. I'm mixing metaphors now. I've got mazes, I've got brick walls. Maybe the walls of the maze are brick. I don't know. I'm sorry for the mixed metaphors. You're going to run into a brick wall at some point where basically either, you realize that the question's unworkable or that getting your research project to actually work is going to be super difficult. Okay, so we'll start with some broad strokes, right? And I've got the inverted pyramid, to kind of symbolize things. It looks like what they told you to do as an introduction on a high school essay. I'm sorry about that. By the way, that approach was terrible. Never do that. But we can talk about writing in another context. I remember, I think teaching a second year undergrad course with essays, and people would start with these super broad, like, through all of human history, and like try to work down to their thesis statement. It's like, okay, let's just take that first sentence out completely and not, or in human society. All right, too broad. All right. So that's writing, that's not research questions. But basically, right, you want to end up with a research question that's fairly focused. And don't worry about this graphic. It's, just an illustration. Okay, what do you need though? When you're doing a research question, and this is generally good practice, you want it to be as clear as possible, so it's understandable by other people, in particular non-experts. So you may have noticed this of academics. Sometimes academics will use a bunch of really big, hard to comprehend words to make things really, really confusing, right? This is sometimes referred to as jargon. Now, a bad research question will often have a lot of jargon in it, right? So very kind of high academic language, often sometimes actually meant more to obscure than to actually illustrate what you're trying to do. So, what would a bad research question be like? I intend to study the way in which human societies through the Anthropocene period may achieve a sort of economic homeostasis towards greater stability and economic sustainability, right? Do you have any idea what I just said? Because that is actually, in fact, a sentence that kind of makes sense. That would be, a sort of research statement rather than a question. But if I phrase that as a question, right, it's jargony, right? What are you actually trying to do? Now this, you may understand it perfectly clearly, but you're going to eventually run into a couple of things, right? Let's say you're doing a master's or a PhD, and you're creating a research project. At some point, you're going to have someone on your committee that's a non-specialist, right? Because you always have to have, especially in Canada, it's less true in the US, you have to have a non-specialist on your committee. And so one of the things that can happen with a bad research question that's very jargony, when you go to, say, a process like candidacy, which is a process when you're doing your PhD, where you do your research proposal and they tell you either yes, proceed, or no, go back to square one and rebuild. The non-specialist person, the external, can be like, no, doesn't make sense. Your question doesn't make sense. So you should use, and always, this is just good writing. I know other people, academics, don't necessarily agree, but I've always been a fan of relatively clear writing, right? And writing that's as much as possible free of jargon. Should I tell you this? Sometimes people use jargon to hide the fact that they're not as smart as they pretend to be, which is why I never use jargon, because I'm exactly as smart as I pretend to be, which is not that smart, to be perfectly honest. Pretty much average intelligence, I think. But yeah, a lot of people will use jargon to kind of hide how dumb they are through really smart sounding words. Don't do that. If you want a research question, you want it so anyone, and especially say you're applying for funding. That's the other thing. Funding bodies like SSHRC, I talked about SSHRC last time. They're the big money in Canada for social sciences and humanities, right? SSHRC. They always have non-specialists on their panels. The other place you're going to get this is research ethics boards. Research ethics boards, if you're doing research with human subjects, are always, one of the people has to be a non-expert. The last, to do survey research and some focus groups, I had applied to the research ethics board, and one of the people on my REB was from the faculty of nursing, right? So not an expert in social science jargony stuff. So you want your research question to be as clear as possible, so it's understandable by other people who A, might be thinking about giving you funding, B, might be a non-specialist on a committee, or might be judging the ethics of your project, right? So straightforward, comprehensible language, as free of jargon as possible, right? What is it what is it you actually want to do? Can you replace jargony words like, I don't know, hegemony with the operation of power, right? Or something like that. Okay. This next one, I'm going to quickly erase everything that I just did. We're going to pretend it never happened. Because this one I think is worth talking about as well, is it researchable? And some of this comes down to how much time you have, how much money you have, how long you want to be working on this particular research project. Is the project, how many graduate students you have working for you? Is it actually researchable? And this, okay, let's say you're doing a master's degree, right? Basically, to do it in the most efficient way possible, and I'm assuming at this point in your academic careers, you all love paying tuition, right? Right, a lot? Okay, once you get to grad school, a fun thing happens, like in your first year of a master's or a PhD, you do coursework, so it feels like you're getting something from your tuition. After that, you're basically paying full tuition for library access and to meet with your supervisor maybe like 3 times. So, you want to minimize the amount of time you spend doing a research project, which means that basically your thing has to be researchable, given the time frame and the resources that you have. I mean, as you go on in your career, you can be a little bit more ambitious, but if you're, I'll put it here, let me give you an example. So one of the first conferences I went to, I was doing a conference presentation on a particular Russian TV show, and I had this other grad student come up to me, and they were working on Indian TV and how it's dispersed across the world, and they wanted to basically do a project looking at how Indian TV has dispersed in North America, China, Russia, Brazil, and like 15 other countries. I'm like, wow, that's really ambitious. Do you speak Portuguese, Russian? No. Actually, I was hoping you could do the Russia part for me. To which I said, no, I'm not doing that. I have my own project, but it wasn't researchable for this person, right? Because they didn't speak any of those languages. And frankly, a global scope for anything is going to be a completely insane project, which this is what I told her. That did not go over that well. I was like, I think your project is non-researchable. And she didn't take it overly well. And now even when she sees me at conferences, she still won't speak to me. And this was 10 years ago. So, people don't like being told their project is not researchable. But out of curiosity, I read her dissertation and she scaled it down and it made a lot more sense. So it's gotta be researchable, right? You've got to kind of narrow it down to a frame that you could reasonably cover. For a master's, you really want to do this in 1 year, right? Because, the extra half year or extra year on a master's that takes your master's to 3 years is derisively called amongst grad students the victory lap. And it can hurt your ability to apply for PhD programs later, because people will be like, oh, a 3-year master's student, what a dilettante. Someone who wastes time. On a PhD, right, again, the longer you are in a PhD program, the more it hurts your job applications when you're going for tenure track jobs. It's like if you took 7 years, like 5 years is like you're the most amazing, intelligent scholar ever, but it's impossible. Except for my friend Sean, who did it, and I hate him. It might have been that his wife was like, look, if you go beyond 5 years, I'm leaving you. So you got it done really quickly. 6 years is not bad. 7 years, people start to look at it like, oh, is this person a serious scholar? And beyond 7 years, you're never going to get an academic job. Or so I've been told. So it has to be researchable, and it has to be you have to be able to complete it within a reasonable time frame. Okay. I think I talked about this last time, a little bit. It has to be related in some ways to other research, because it's very rare that you're going to be doing a completely original research, right? You're building on other research, other traditions. Maybe you're critiquing them, but in some ways, you have to situate it within academic literature. So your research question has to kind of, be structured as such as it's like within an existing body of literature, right? You don't necessarily, especially at a junior level, want to be casting out into the deep, and going for a totally new research topic. And then this, I'm saying like it has to be researchable. You don't want it to be too broad or too narrow, right? Too narrow, the problem being is your research is going to be too niche. No one's going to want to publish it because it's too niche. And no one's going to cite it because it's, not going to be seen as particularly interesting. And I mean, my honest admission, when I was doing my research, and this is probably bad supervision, my first supervisor was an alcoholic who didn't pay attention to me, and who I had to beg for time with, and probably didn't supervise my project well enough. Russian TV turned out to be a project in some ways too niche, right? Nobody cites my papers, though I think they're very interesting. Weirdly, they don't get that many citations. I think because it's too narrow, right? It's too narrow a topic. Russian TV is just a little bit too small, or too broad, right? I think I told you about this grad student. He's behind me. I was doing my PhD. He was doing his master's, and he wanted to I think essentially rewrite the whole canon. Like he was going to go and kind of, rewrite everything in sociology from Marx through Foucault to, comport with some kind of view he had of climate change. And because he also had bad supervisors, they do exist, and actually they're far too frequent. If you're going to do a PhD or a master's in this department, talk to me privately, and I'll try to steer you away from those. But his topic was massive, right? And I remember the chair at the time, after he dropped out, not before, which, whatever, was like, yeah, I always read that, and I was like, this is not so much the project of a master's, but the project of a lifetime. So, he dropped out for some reason and never got his master's. You definitely don't want to do that, right? Too broad, right? Too big of a topic. You're never going to be able to finish. You're going to get frustrated. And it's going to be just this massive thing, right? Undoable, and you don't want to fail before you start. So you want something that's like a reasonable scope, like a real phenomenon that you could study within a reasonable time period. And then you're going to have to structure a question to get to that, right? So again, I would say aim at middle range, right? Middle range theory. You're going to come up with a middle range theory of some kind, of some phenomenon. And it should be fairly grounded. So, something kind of reasonable that you could study. Could you study, could you do some survey research about youth mental health and its relationship to, phone and social media use? That's pretty grounded, right? You can get, and you probably want to narrow that down to a scope, right? Let's say if you're doing your master's, you want to say, at U of A or in Edmonton, right? Or maybe Alberta, depends on how much hot money you got burning through your pocket, because surveys get expensive, right? But it's fairly grounded, it's limited in scope. So what's the relationship between time spent on social media and phones and mental health, right? So, or loneliness or something like that. That's a fairly grounded question that should be relatively easy to answer, get data for, and analyze that data and write something up. It's situated within a big body of literature. Easy peasy, lemon squeezy. There we go. Have I mentioned I have young kids, so I say a lot of really dad things like easy peasy, lemon squeezy. Okay, so I say young kids. I guess my daughter is 14, almost 15. And so the gap between you and her at some point is going to get much smaller than the gap between me and you. So I don't know. It's a distressing thought that makes me feel really old. Okay. I'll tell you other things that make me feel distressingly old, but not right now. I mean, like walking down the hall with my headphones in so people think I can't hear them. I just forgot to turn on music. And hearing people be like, oh yeah, that's the guy. I love that bald professor over there. In one way, good. In one way, ow. Although, random thing. Apparently, some people still, I'm in my 40s, sadly. But I've had people be like, you're probably like 36. I'm like, I don't know why you think that. Apparently shaving your head removes a lot of context as to how old you are. So people are like guessing sometimes, in late 30s, somewhere in like early 50s. It depends on the person. So it can be good and bad. All right. Sadness abounds. Okay. All right. So the choice of research question, design, and method have to ask the question being asked, right? And this is, important, and it's going to be one of the things that you're going to have to come up with. I'm trying to think of a mismatch. Let's say you want to find out, about time spent on social media, and smartphone time, and the link to mental health, right? Now, a good kind of way of measuring some of these things would probably be a survey, right? You can ask a bunch of survey questions about mental health, about how people use their smartphones, and kind of get a bunch of data. Probably a less good way would be something like an ethnography, right? I'm going to go hang out with a bunch of high school students. Always fraught, for lots of reasons. But it wouldn't be, so the research orientation, right? You're asking let's say here you're asked in the scenario I've come up with, you're asking a quantitative question, right? With a fundamentally kind of positivist epistemology. So you'd have to choose a way of doing that project, that has that sort of orientation, a design that makes sense, right? So I'm going to go hang out with high school students and talk to them about their mental health and their phone use. You're not going to get great results from that compared to a survey, right? So it has to add your design and your method. I lost my slide. There it is. Have to match the question that you're asking. Okay. Yeah, and I mean, just things like, what are you doing, fundamentally quantitative, qualitative research? Are you measuring an impact, right? Are you putting things like, an independent variable and a dependent variable or several dependent variables and seeing how they're related? Are you hypothesis testing, right? All of these things kind of have to fit together. And so worldview, I just mean like, are you using, what kind of epistemology and ontology are you assuming, or do you have when you're doing this sort of research project? So all of these things kind of have to match, right? You can't, you could, it's not the best idea necessarily to do grounded research quantitatively, where it's like, I'm just going to go and get a bunch of data and then I'm going to come up with a hypothesis to try and explain it. It's a little bit backwards. So everything kind of has to fit together, A, because you're going to be more productive that way, and B, because the academy has its certain patterns. So when you go to propose something, right, again, to SHRC, to a committee, to a research ethics board, they're going to be expecting to see certain kind of ways of doing things and how it works together, or you may not get passed, you may not get money and all of that stuff. So, your research question has to be related to the kind of research design that you're going to do. And don't worry, we'll talk about all this some more. Okay, so the choice of your research method should match your research question, right? Research question is the purpose of the study in the form of a question. Like, what is it you're trying to find out, right? So examples, these are from the textbook. What social factors make people enjoy smoking marijuana, right? So if you're asking this particular question, you need to make sure that you have some kind of way of figuring that out. Now, I'd say that's probably more of a qualitative question, because you're going to want to ask people about what their experience of smoking marijuana is, what kind of social situations they do it in, why they want to do it in those situations, what motivates them, all those kind of things, right? So you want, in terms of that, you need your method to match, and that's probably something like interviews, so you can talk to people and get really deep explanations of their social circumstances, right? That's where I would probably go. You could do a survey for this, but you're likely to get fairly surface information, right? Like, I'm just trying to think sorry, I've never smoked marijuana, so I'm trying to imagine, I'm doing like method acting. I'm trying to put myself in the mind of a marijuana smoker. I'm gonna get me some Cheetos and drop my IQ 20 points. Sorry. I'm kidding. But seriously, don't smoke marijuana until you're 25. It actually can affect your IQ. It's bad for you. Research, the science is settled, more or less. Okay, so now I forgot what I was talking about. Sometimes I derail myself with my own jokes. I'm really sorry. I do this at times. Right, I was method acting, trying to figure out, what we could talk about. Okay, so what would we get in terms of survey research with, say, people smoking marijuana? Well, you might get, do you smoke it alone, or how often do you smoke it? Do you smoke it alone? Do you smoke, like, what reason would you give for why you smoke marijuana? Right, you're going to get, I think, some fairly surface level, in data if you're doing this question quantitatively with like a survey. Now, if you go, interview people, who are marijuana smokers, maybe or do an ethnography, right? Hang out with people who smoke marijuana and see the social circumstances in which they do it. And I don't know, maybe you can get the university or the government to pay for your weed. I don't know. It might be, maybe not a life goal, but it's possible anyway. That would be possibly a better way because you get more of the social context around it. And you can ask people, questions about their enjoyment of smoking marijuana. Okay. Now this question, right, obviously, what explains differential rates of suicide in societies or in different kind of socioeconomic strata, or this kind of thing, it's probably best answered quantitatively, right? And probably through either some kind of, survey research is probably not going to work. It's hard to, ask people about why they took their own life. That's not going to work. But you're probably looking at a bunch of existing kind of medical government data, right? Stuff from Statistics Canada that you could use to analyze existing data, right? And we'll talk about analyzing existing data sets. It's a perfectly, I had an argument with Sandra about this, who's my boss. They were making fun of people who just analyze other people's data. They're like, well, shouldn't be held on the same level as our research that we did ourselves. And I'm like, well, they come up with some pretty awesome conclusions, so shh. Don't say that. It's actually a perfectly valid research methodology. Anyway, you're probably looking there, you're analyzing survey data or government statistics, existing statistics from other sources, right? Because you're not likely I dropped my little paperclip. You're not likely to, find other ways of collecting that data. Okay, and then my favorite one, this is mine. What is it like to be a member of the furry fandom or the furry subculture, right? A survey would not be particularly appropriate if you want to find out about the inner lives of furries. Oh, I so apologize if any of you are furries in your spare time. So we're going to talk about this a lot for no particular reason. Just that it's a very illustrative example and everyone giggles, so I like it. What is it like to be a member of the furry community, right? Well, then you probably want to do interviews, right? You want to talk to people who are furries about their fursonas. I love this word. I've learned so much during the course of teaching this class about furry fandom. Their fursonas and what it's like and why they do these things, and all sorts of interesting and perhaps distressing things about the furry subculture. But you'd probably want to go to action and actually talk to people because, for example, on a survey, it's a pretty small portion of the population. If you could even come up with enough of a survey to get really interesting information, you're not really that likely to find enough of them to do a survey that's representative. So you probably just want to go down to what I assume is the Edmonton Furry Con. I actually don't know. I assume there's a place in Edmonton where this subculture gathers, and just be like, hey, I'm a researcher. Want to talk to me? And, strangely, more often than not, people kind of do. I'll tell you more about my friend Kelly later in the course, but her master's research project was super fun. She wanted to find out about men who play World of Warcraft using female avatars. So like, why? Why do they do this? I have to tell you this. Her first paper off of this that she published was called Big-Breasted Night Elves and the Men Who Love to Play brackets as them. You know, and I've never actually read the whole thing, but the title has always tremendously amused me. And Kelly always had a way of writing paper titles that were awesome. She now works at a university in Hawaii, which she insists is hell. It sounds pretty good to me. It's going to sound better in like November. One of the things she did, right, is, you know, to talk to men who play as female avatars in World of Warcraft. She created an avatar in World of Warcraft that she called Survey Lady, and she would just tag along on people's raids and talk to them and set up interviews on Skype afterwards, so that she could talk to them about why they played as female avatars in World of Warcraft. So now that I've given you strange and terrible ideas, I think her PhD was on EVE Online somehow, but again, I didn't actually read that one, and it didn't have as memorable of titles as that particular paper. So you just have to pick, right? Make sure that your research question, and you know, in that case, it was, why do some men choose to play as female avatars with especially large breasts? I may have added that last part in. You know, why do some men choose to play as female avatars in World of Warcraft, right? And then how do you figure that out? Well, you got to go talk to them, right? You're not going to be able to do a survey where people are going to then, you're not going to find enough men in a survey that play as female avatars to get meaningful data by doing a survey. Okay. Thank you for that. Oh, I've just accepted it. I've embraced it. I have a friend who's definitively losing his hair, and he's like, no, my hair's always been like this. And I'm like, okay, you keep telling yourself that. Just embrace it. All right. So I thought that was my last slide, but this is in fact my last slide. Okay. So I love that that's the only comment people put in. It's not like a question or anything related to the course. It's not one of the jokes. Okay. I'm good with it. All right. So the form of your question is going to be shaped, you know, by whether it is a quantitative or qualitative study, right? So qualitative, generally kind of less specific. No hypothesis, right? So you're not going to be like, you know, you're not going to hypothesize that, you know, social media time and phone time is correlated to, you know, higher rates of mental illness and loneliness in young people. Right? You're not going to put any of that in there. It's going to be somewhat unspecific, like what, you know, like what's it like to be a furry, right? What is it like to be a member of the furry fandom in Edmonton or something, right? Typically, it's going to be inductive, right? So again, you're going to be proposing, you know, a research question that's going to go from, you know, data to theory, right? So you don't have a theory to start with. Quantitative, going to be a little bit different, right? So often, a narrowed research question to make testable hypotheses, right? So your research question is going to be set up in such a way as you can then kind of branch hypotheses off of them. And like I said, if you've ever read a quantitative research paper, as I'm sure we all do on Friday nights when we need to, you know, entertain ourselves, right? You're all like, yes, it's not rewatching The Office for the 50th time. We all go find quantitative research studies. You know, they'll often be like, okay, this is our research question. This is H1, this is H2, this is H3, right? So you want a question that you can branch some hypotheses off of that you can then test. And yeah, typically it's going to be deductive, right? So I had these hypotheses. I designed my survey around these hypotheses and, you know, gathered the data, tested the data. You know, H1 was right. H2 was wrong. Sorry, that should have been checked. H1 was wrong, H2 was right, and H3 needed more data. It was inconclusive, right? So typically that's the way you kind of construct these questions. So again, qualitative is going to be more like, you know, what's the experience of single mothers doing a university degree at the University of Alberta in 2000, or at Alberta universities, if you want to make it a little bigger, in 2024, right? So no hypothesis. You're just going to be like, I'm going to go talk to some single mothers who are doing university degrees. Versus, what's the, what is the link between single motherhood and low, let me think. Raised by a single mother and academic achievement of their children, right? And then your H1 might be, children of single mothers will have lower academic achievement because, and that might not be true, but because of, these factors. H2 would be, they will struggle more to make connections, especially with male teachers because of X, Y, Z, all of these sorts of things you can come up with, which you could then design your survey to test, right? But hopefully you can see the difference. Okay. Sorry, I should have asked if you have any questions. I've just been like plowing through my content for 35 minutes. Yes, please.
Just like connecting it to like the law stuff we're gonna do in like the research question, are we just using like two variables, like saying like we're saying like young mothers and education? Could you add like young mothers, say like age when they had the kids and
yeah, you could. Okay. Yeah, and I mean, especially my research questions are a little bit two factor. One thing that you definitely will want to think about is something that has a lot of potential measures, right? So mental health, for example, could have, educational attainment could have a lot of potential measures, right? It could be years of school, it could be grades, it could be degrees and diplomas, right? These sorts of things. It could be eventual, like, you could link it to earnings, right? How much they eventually make. So you could branch it out into lots of things. But yeah, generally speaking, when you're creating a research question, one comment that either L'Oreal or myself might give it is, it's a good question, but yeah, when you come to actually writing, say, a survey, it's going to be like, were you a single mother? Or was your mother a single mother? Yes. What's the highest level of education you've achieved? Grade 12. All right, those are all my questions, right? And that's not going to give you much interesting stuff to analyze. So you definitely want to pick, things that you could measure that might have, multiple kind of measurements, right? So, like I said, educational attainment could be a lot of things. Life satisfaction. Oh, life satisfaction. You can have multiple measures of life satisfaction. So things like that. You do want to write it in such a way as you can get a bunch of different kinds of questions that are measuring something similar. So that's a really good question. But yeah, I mean, we'll work with you on that in the lab, and I'm spitballing a lot of these off the top of my head because that's how I roll. Any other questions before I jump in? I sadly have 13 minutes left, so we can start on the next topic. Yeah, please.
So is qualitative research more from error and biases or is it like less encouraged because it's not
so there's different schools of thought on this. That certainly is one of the critiques of qualitative research. When people talk about qualitative research, one of the things that there's a big split, quantitative, qualitative, where neither side kind of respects each other in lots of ways, especially quantitative to qualitative for this exact reason. And yeah, one of the critiques is that it's much more open to bias, right? That the values of the researcher are much more likely to influence their interpretation of things because it's less scientific in a sense, less positivist, less like, well, this is the measure I got, and it's less repeatable, right? A lot of qualitative studies fundamentally are not repeatable, right? So whereas like I could run the same survey with the same questions to compare, right? It's good. I would never be able to reproduce a qualitative study because I'm not going to talk to the same people. Even those people will have changed, right? Those people fundamentally will have changed. The time frame will be different. Little things in the environment might change it. I myself, as the researcher, might have influenced it in a particular way that a different researcher trying to reproduce the same study would, do differently. So they tend to be seen as much less repeatable. I don't want to say this is a problem, but it's a huge problem. And I know in psychology, but I think this is equally true in sociology. They're starting to talk about a lot of the problems with these disciplines as the repeatability problem, right? That no one's even trying to repeat studies. So you can sort of, how shall we say this, in a way that won't get me fired. There's been a lot of, shall we say, bullshit published where people just sort of like manufacture results because they know that no one is ever going to attempt to repeat this study because it's not repeatable. And so it's called the replication crisis. Very few people try to replicate a lot of social science research. And it's led to some problems where some studies have flat out made up findings and nobody, it comes out later, but nobody really tried. There was a really famous hoax a couple of years ago where basically to troll the social sciences and especially what they called the grievance studies disciplines. So queer studies, women and gender studies, and a few others, these 3 researchers from Portland just made up studies and findings and got them published in prominent journals in those fields. Basically, they were trying to prove that those fields are dumb. It got discovered eventually, and also that the peer review process is fundamentally flawed. It got picked up eventually, but not before I think 3 of their papers had been published and 1 had won an award. I think that was the one about how dog parks reproduced rape culture. Yeah, look it up, right? This is Peter Boghossian and, I forget the other one. Boghossian eventually got fired over it from Portland State University. But yeah, they created a bunch of fake papers to basically prove that there's a lot of problems with humanities and social science research. And yeah, a bunch of pretty prominent journals published them because it fit their political and intellectual priors. So yeah, don't do that. That's not recommended. But yeah, this is a problem with qualitative research. People are like, if all your observations are qualitative, they're not objective. And so they're hard to reproduce. And therefore, they might lack some legitimacy, right, increasingly. So anyway, I'm sorry, that was a really long, rambling answer to your question. But yeah, a lot of people harp on qualitative research. But I will say there's a lot of good qualitative research that might tell you about a specific phenomenon that might not be reproducible, but it still tells you something about the world. And I wouldn't say that all the actors in qualitative research are bad in making up their findings, right? There are problems, but quantitative research can be open to problems too, right? Where people can skew findings, not run certain kinds of analyses because there's things they don't want to find. So no type of research, I guess any kind of research is only as good as the researcher doing it and how honest that person happens to be, right? So even in like medicine where you'd think things should be pretty objective, right? Either the drug works or it doesn't. There's been lots of, shall we say, shenanigans where drug companies are like, it would be really great if Ozempic proved to be safe because we've put a lot of money into it. Don't take Ozempic. It's not proven at all. There's no longitudinal studies on it that go beyond like 5 years. Not that any of you probably need Ozempic. I definitely do, but I'll just get up at 5:30 every day and exercise. That'll be better. But that was a really good question. It's a really good question. And yeah, that's definitely one of the critiques of qualitative research, that it lacks objectivity because fundamentally it's about people's experiences, and sometimes the way you ask questions can shape that pretty strongly. Your interpretations can skew it. Yeah, it's, again, like, nothing's perfect. But anyway, now I'm rambling and trying to make excuses for qualitative research, because at my heart, I am a qualitative researcher who dabbles in quantitative research sometimes. So anyway, other questions? Am I out of time? I got like 6 minutes. Okay, other questions? If you ask one more question, we can probably avoid jumping into a new topic. No, I'm kidding. Hang on. Should we? All right, I give you the vote. I would only usually do this when Joan was here, but she's not in this class. She's in my other class. And she was the one in this class last year that told me when I'd gone too far and you couldn't take it anymore. Do you want to start for 5 minutes on a new topic, or do you want 5 minutes of your life back? Yeah, okay. All right, why don't we jump into the next topic on Friday then? It's like I could pee or get coffee in that time. All right, we'll start on the next topic on Friday.